Buongiorno. Good afternoon, persons of quality. Welcome to the Aquinas Lecture Series. In fact, welcome to the last talk this academic year in the Aquinas Lecture Series. Our presenter today is Dr. Penny Avery from the Communication Department, and her title today, her talk, is Risk-Taking Behavior and Communication Patterns, Choices, Pressures, and Consequences. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Avery.
Thank you. I know this is a very busy time of the year, and I appreciate you taking the time to be here. So as I began to explore the general topic of risk-taking, I explored the literature, of course, and 5 key areas began to emerge, and that sort of directed the course of my project. What I originally submitted to the development committee for my sabbatical review didn't end up exactly being the project that I pursued, and I think that that's probably quite common because often when we present the proposal for the development committee, we haven't fully looked at the literature. And as I began to explore the literature, I discovered that what I was intending to focus on wasn't really where the greatest need was. And so I looked at literature on shifts in communication practices, especially for young adults. My target audience was college students, specifically Aquinas College students. I wanted to better understand the patterns of communication as they shifted for this demographic. I also wanted to look at general risk-taking behavior in communication and practices and how that might connect to some of the other things that we explore in our classes in communication. I then began to discover that there was a great deal of literature dealing with social networking and risk-taking behavior, and that was really where my interest began to be refined in terms of what I wanted to dedicate my research time to. Ego involvement in decision-making also became an important part of this, because just because a pattern exists doesn't mean that it's an important pattern. And so I wanted to understand what is it that drives people's decision-making and how important are those factors in their lives. So oftentimes we might do a behavior on a regular basis that we don't really identify as all that important of a behavior, and other behaviors that we may do less frequently but are critically important to who we are as people. And then finally, I wanted to look at the connection to employment and internships. We have quite a few of our students who go out into internship placements. Sister Rosemary O'Donnell is our liaison with the Career and Counseling Center for our internships, and we certainly want to prepare our students for employment, even if they don't pursue an internship first. So as I looked at that literature, I developed a strategy for exploring these patterns and developed an argument for why this is an important area of investigation. First, the literature itself points to the need for more scholarly research, pursuing what does it mean to take greater risks, specifically in the area of social networking, and what impact might that have on people in both short-term and long-term consequences. It's an area of great flux. We see that the options for social networking are constantly changing, and certainly even within a given social network, the application to that is in flux. A lot of change going on. Our department is motivated to explore this because we have student learning outcomes that deal with students evaluating themselves in various contexts as well as evaluating other people in various contexts. And I also thought that the results may help the college identify and consider possible policies and guidelines dealing with either identifying students at risk or intervening when they're potentially making choices that can have long-term consequences. My project took place in 3 phases. So there were 3 different subject groups for each of the 3 phases. The first phase was with 2 sections of CN 101 students, again, because we wanted to use I wanted to use this data ultimately to help our department. In addition to serving me, I utilized students over the course of both last year and this year in terms of these 3 phases to explore these issues. So I had 50 students, my 2 CN 101 sections at the time that I was teaching the course. And the students were asked, overall, do you think you take more, fewer, or the same level of communication risks in social networking messages compared to face-to-face messaging? So I just wanted them to think about their own face-to-face interactions with people and how would they evaluate the kinds of risks that they take, disclosive risks, in those kinds of interactions compared to the kinds of risks that they take in social networking contexts. So to begin, before I tell you what they said, I want to find out what you think about this. So there are 3 different colored slips on the table. If you believe that you take more risks in social networking messaging, now if you are not a participant on any social network whatsoever, you don't participate in Facebook or LinkedIn or MySpace or any of the other myriad options for social networking, then you're not going to pick up a slip because you don't have a point of comparison. But assuming that, that some of you do, you will select a blue slip if you perceive that you take more risks in social networking messages, a white slip if you perceive that you have the same amount of risks in social networking messaging compared to face-to-face, and a pink slip if you perceive that you engage in fewer risks. You don't have slips? In terms of disclosure, risk for this study was defined as those messages that may be interpreted by other people with negative valence, that it might cause other people to have a negative interpretation of that message. So, and that was defined for the participants as well. So when they thought about things that they said, or things that they posted, whether it be pictures or text in social networking sites, they were asked to consider to what degree they think that these behaviors, messaging, could be interpreted by other people with negative valence, with negative interpretation. So if you would pick your slip, and then at the count of 3, I'm just going to ask you to raise your hand with the color slip you have. And we're just going to glance around and see if we're all the same or different. All right? So pick your slip. Blue, more risks. White, same risks. And pink, fewer risks in social networking compared to face-to-face. Okay? 1, 2, 3. So we have all the colors of the rainbow. Isn't that lovely? So we don't have the same opinions within this group, and certainly there were differences within the sample of 50. For the subjects of these 2 101 sections, 54% of them, 27, said that they actually engage in more risks in social network messaging than they do in face-to-face. 10 of them said that they engage in the same amount of risks, and 13 said that they actually engage in fewer risks. When I ran a chi-square analysis of difference, it was significant. There were significantly more people reporting that they take greater risks in social network messaging. By the way, over the course of our discussion, I'm not necessarily always telling the statistical test result just because of space on the slides, but I have all of that information if you're interested in t-test results or correlational analysis or chi-square. So I also asked the students, in addition to do you take more, the same, or fewer risks, what kinds of risks they potentially took in terms of social networking. So I asked them, have you ever posted verbal messaging, words, about yourself or another person that you later wished you hadn't? And again, I didn't stipulate the specific social network context. It could be any of their experiences with any of the tools that might be available. 23 of them said no, 27 said yes. So it was fairly evenly divided, and that chi-square, the probability is greater than 0.05. So this means that there was not a significant difference between the two groups. So we have 54% saying yes, but because there were only two groups of classification, that's why we don't have a difference here. But realize that we also had 54% in the beginning say that they do take more risks. So it makes sense that we have this alignment. I also asked them if they'd ever posted pictures of themselves or other people that they later wished they hadn't. And with this one, only 18 people said that they had posted a picture that they later wished they hadn't. Realize, though, that the issue of others' negative interpretation may not be even in the person's awareness that they should have perhaps wished they hadn't posted that. This is self-report, so I didn't ask them for all of their passwords, etc. I didn't friend them all to evaluate these myself to see would I have said that those pictures were a problem. I relied upon them telling me, have you ever posted a picture that you later wish you hadn't? So what does that tell us? That 54% of the students report that they take more risks in social networking messages. 54% also said that they had posted verbal messages that they regretted, that they later wished they hadn't. And 36% reported having posting pictures that they later wished they hadn't. So there was some level of regret there as well. That was the first phase. The second phase was that I wanted to create a fictitious Facebook page that would incorporate some risk elements, and that I was going to manipulate the risk elements on the page. And so a persuasion class that I taught evaluated the fictitious page because it was the nature of the class where we were evaluating lots of ideological campaigns for realism and effectiveness. So I asked them to look at the fictitious page, and I asked them to, first of all, identify the risk-taking behaviors so that I could see if they were overt enough so that people could pick up on them. And then I asked them to give me some suggestions for realism. And part of the reason why I did this is because I'm not the target demographic. You know, what is real to me might not be real to a 19-year-old. So I relied on students to say, no one would ever say that. No one would ever post that picture. And so I made modifications based upon the feedback that the students gave. So it resulted in this page, which I'm going to have some help here distributing. And what I would like you to do is, is to look at the page and to see if you can identify any elements, words or pictures that might be perceived by another person as risk-taking behavior. And I'll give you just a minute to look it over. So all of these people these are all made up people. Are you ready? Have you found a few that might be problematic? There were actually 6 elements that were embedded in the Facebook page that represented varying levels of risk, but that came from what the literature said. Specifically, internship directors and employers were identifying the most concern with. And I didn't want them all to be so outrageous that there wouldn't be some change in the nature of the risk, but I wanted them to be, at least some of them, to be overt enough that that people would be able to identify certain qualities. Okay, so here's what they were. If you have your sheet in front of you, the picture, of course, with the Pat Johnson and Chris Green's comment of partay. So that was the picture, and the tag on the picture was classified as one risk-taking behavior. The second was the comment by A.J. Kelly directly underneath the picture. And right underneath A.J. Kelly's comment, Jordan Lee's comment was also classified as risk-taking behavior. Those were center on the page. Those were the ones that I suspected people would most likely pull out, and then the other three were a little bit more subtle. One was Jessica's tag name, Girl Gone Wild Franz. Putting Girl Gone Wild as part of the person's name, internship directors and employers have identified that just even how you identify yourself is potentially a red flag for them in terms of placement and hiring. Aaron Bryant's comment about wanting to buy a paper, and facetiously potentially, but nonetheless, it's there. And then the last one was actually Sam Barker's kissing profile picture, the one that's in the upper left-hand corner. Again, you might say, well, what's wrong with a kiss? But that is something that, again, internship directors and employers have identified that they prefer that not be, that there be romantic or sexual exchange of any kind being on these pages. So then the third phase of the project, which was 103 CN students, all of the sections of communication, actually in this semester, completed phase 3 of the project, and they certainly answered the largest number of questions. I asked them to evaluate the Facebook page on a series of Likert-type items. And they simply went through and circled a number for each of the items in terms of how they felt about the issue. I asked them to actually list all of the risk-taking messages from the sample that they saw. And I didn't prompt them in terms of how many there were. I just said, look carefully at the sample and identify any words and or pictures that you perceive as risk-taking. And again, I defined that meant that somebody else could have a negative interpretation of that. I asked them to indicate whether they thought internship directors and employers would potentially have a concern, and those were two separate questions, internship director concern and employer concern. I asked them if they had a Facebook account themselves, because I thought that might drive perhaps the issue of their perception. How many times they actually access that Facebook account typically per week. How many Facebook friends that they have, and I asked them for an approximation of the number of their Facebook friends. And then I asked them a series of questions for those obviously who had Facebook to evaluate their own account, their own sense of risk-taking and a number of other variables using the same Likert-type scale that I used for the sample. I asked them how important Facebook is to them, if they have it, and whether they believe college faculty and college students should be friends on Facebook. This is an area of great interest for whatever reason, certainly at the K-12 level, but even with adult students. There's quite a bit of literature, both academic and just layperson literature dealing with this issue of boundaries and whether it's appropriate or not for college faculty and college students to be friends on Facebook. And then, of course, I asked some demographic questions, their class standing, their biological sex, and their age. So they represented exactly what we would expect them to represent in terms of the college as a whole and certainly the communication department. Because it's a 100 level class, the majority of the students were first year students, and then you can see the breakdown in the other class designations. Our sex breakdown, I think, is fairly typical of the college as well. And then because most of the students were in their first year of college, makes sense that the mean age is about 20. So what did they report? So the first thing, of course, was I wanted to know if they had a Facebook account themselves. This wasn't the first item on the survey, but in terms of evaluating the reaction to the other items, I wanted to know. So let's find out in terms of this audience if you have a Facebook account yourself. Blue is yes and pink is no. So hold up your slip. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pink slips, a lot more blue slips than pink slips. I'd have to do a quick assessment here in terms of the ratio of the group, but in terms of that question for our students, any guess in terms of percentage of students who report having a Facebook account? It wasn't 100, but it is in the 90s, 91.2%, 26%. So 94 out of the 103 students in these classes reported having a Facebook account. I also asked them, how many times per week on average do you go to your account? Now, I didn't ask them for minutes. You know, how long does that equate to be? So it could be a person goes for a quick look, it could be they spend 4 hours. I didn't ask that because I think that would be, without having them do a diary, that would be a very difficult thing to have be very accurate. I figured they could give me a fairly accurate ballpark in terms of how often they go. On average, our students in these CN 101 sections go to their Facebook account just over 22 times per week. And on average, they have 512.89 friends. That's quite a bit more than I think 22 that I have or something. So 512. I actually had one student write a comment on his survey. It was such a precise number. He had 1,215, and I thought, please, is this person playing me? And underneath it, he wrote, and it was a he, in case you doubt this, I just checked the number this morning. I mean, he was tracking exactly how many friends he had, so he knew that his estimation was correct. So one of the things that I certainly wanted to look at, because it's an area of interest in our literature, is whether results represent any sex differences. Do men and women view these issues of risk-taking and evaluation of the sample differently? And actually, out of the entire survey, there were only 2 items that showed a significant difference based upon biological sex. In the 2 items asking if the Facebook sample was typical and if the Facebook sample was common, women scored that significantly higher. So again, if you're not a t-test person, that's fine, but both of these had a 95% confidence interval. So in both cases, women reported that it was more typical and more common. The sample itself, the fictitious sample. None of the other questions had a significant sex difference. When I asked some questions relating to times per week and friends, for the remainder, I'm really only sharing with you the things that had significance, because there are lots of possible combination of items to look at, but I'm focusing on the ones that I think are of most interest potentially to you. So the more times they reported accessing their account, the more regret that they report about the messaging that they post on their Facebook. That makes sense to me, that you go there a lot, eventually you might say something or post a picture that you later say, maybe I shouldn't have done that. So practice apparently doesn't make perfect in this case. You post more, you go more, you tend to have self-reflected regret. Again, this isn't, we might say, well, there should have been even more people who had some regret there. This was self-evaluated regret. The more Facebook friends they reported having, the more realistic they perceived the Facebook sample to be. This also makes sense to me because the more friends you have, probably the more variation in Facebook pages that you see. And you probably see some outrageous things if you have 1,200 and some friends and you're proud of it. You probably do see some more pictures or statements on there that you wonder, I'm not sure about that, which would increase the perception of realism. I specifically wanted to address this issue of whether they thought internship directors and employers would have a problem with this Facebook page. So I don't have a pink slip, blue slip question, but I'm going to ask you. Blue slip means yes. Pink slip means no. So blue is yes, pink is no. How many of you think that an internship director looking at that sample that you had in front of you would have problems, concerns with taking on the student who is utilizing this as a Facebook account? Ready? Raise your slips. Okay. One pink slip. Everybody else says internship directors are going to be concerned with this. Well, there were some driving variables in terms of the likelihood for students to perceive that internship directors would have concerns. If they saw the Facebook sample as risky, harmful, and unacceptable. So again, these were on Likert type scales. And I wanted to have a wide range of possibilities. So rather than having a typical Likert scale with only 5 responses, I extended that because I wanted there to not be a floor effect or a ceiling effect in terms of students feeling as though they didn't have an option that really represented how they felt. So the more risky they perceive the sample to be, the more harmful they perceive the sample to be, and the more unacceptable they perceive the sample to be, the more they thought internship directors would be concerned with this. I asked the same thing in terms of employers. So blue slip, pink slip again. Are employers going to be concerned with this Facebook account? Okay, everybody has a blue slip except one. I actually had one of the subjects write, he circled high concern, but underneath it, the student wrote, but it's none of the employer's business. So he identified that there would be high concern, but it seemed to be that the implication was, but I don't think it's fair, that it shouldn't be the employer's business, but I do think the employer would be concerned with it. The more risky, harmful, unacceptable, and abnormal, that one was added in terms of a significant correlation, the more that they perceived that employers would be concerned with the Facebook page. When I looked at the issue of their assessment of their own Facebook accounts, so I wanted to look, is there a connection between how they perceive their own accounts and how they perceive the sample? One of the interesting findings was this issue of individuals who perceive that they're very cautious on their own page. The more cautious that they perceived their own account to be, the more risky and harmful they perceive the sample to be. So, these are individuals that are on Facebook, they're posting pictures, potentially, they're making comments, but they're very aware that there might be another audience beyond strictly their close friends and family that might be able to tap into this and see these. So they're presenting themselves in a more cautious manner and are concerned with the Facebook sample. Interestingly, to me anyway, the individuals, in terms of their cautious nature on Facebook, that drove how many items of risk they identified from the sample. So I literally counted for each sample. I went through each subject, counted the number of risk-taking behaviors they were able to identify out of the 6 that were implemented in there. And the more cautious they perceived their own Facebook page to be, the more risk behaviors they identified on the sample. Another thing sort of emerged that was completely unintentional. The ambassador connection on the Facebook page and the intramural sports on the left-hand side. The individuals who identified themselves as very cautious also commented that they were concerned about those links being there. They said, if you are going to put those kinds of things on your Facebook page, you don't want to highlight the other things you're connected with that might have a problem with the things you've just posted. And I thought that was interesting because those were put on there just to fill out the page, to try to make it seem like a real Facebook page. I really had no intention of them making a connection back to those little connections on the side, but the individuals who perceived themselves as being highly cautious did. The more important they perceived Facebook to be, this was a major variable on a number of levels. This gets to that ego involvement issue. So the more I think about Facebook, the more it's part of who I am, the more important it is to me in terms of my day-to-day functioning, the more normal, acceptable, typical, realistic, and common that they perceived the Facebook sample to be. So the individuals that are using Facebook a lot and saying it's important to who I am start to see a normalcy in that sample. And we actually see this in other forms of research where people, for example, are exposed to mainstream pornography and then respond to questions about sexual behaviors of adults in the United States, and just being exposed to, in a treatment setting, probably wouldn't do this at Aquinas College, but in a treatment setting to mainstream pornography, it immediately affects their perception of the likelihood of U.S. adults participating in certain sexual behaviors. It creates a normalcy perception. And it appears that this is the case with this as well. If it's a core to who you are, you start to think of this kind of sample as being, that's not all that far off the mark. That's normal to me and acceptable. The more important they perceive Facebook to be, the more times per week they reported using it. Well, that makes sense. If something's important to you, you probably do more of that thing. And the more, this is now they're reflecting on their own Facebook pages, the more they perceive their own Facebook account material to be exciting, risky, and self-disclosive. So again, this is themselves saying, Facebook is very important to me. The more important it is to me, the more I find that my page is exciting, the more I perceive my page as being risky, and the more I say about myself, the more I tell personal information about myself. When I look at what the literature says from an employer perspective, this is just one example. George Leonard, who is a lawyer, an employment lawyer, and a blogger on the issue of employers using Facebook accounts and other social networking tools to make decisions, he highlights in his blog that there are two primary functions that employers use: identifying potential job candidates through social electronic database searches in the form of headhunting. They literally will type in a keyword, a key headhunting word, a skill, or a trade that they're looking for, and it can assist in a search process to identify people who use that terminology on their Facebook page. So they're using it to find people potentially for employment opportunities. I thought that was interesting because so often we think about the employment process as being, I send you an application and a cover letter, but in terms of certain skill sets, it goes the other way. The other issue, which certainly I'm more concerned about because I think it's more relevant to our students, I'm doubting that headhunters are necessarily going to be snatching up our students. They are using Facebook pages to do background check in the form of disqualifying candidates for employment, demonstration of illegal drug use or other behavior unbecoming of the company. Those were the two main things discussed on his blog, but I can certainly think of other ways that I know of employers using Facebook accounts. My husband is a high school teacher, and there's a phrase in his contract, it's a very ubiquitous phrase, that is basically that any behavior unbecoming of a teacher enabled in terms of being able to fulfill teaching responsibilities in the classroom can be reason for dismissal. So he's an actor in addition to directing theater productions at Jenison. There have been times when he's gone to his superintendent or the personnel director and has said, I'd like to audition for such and such show, and the personnel director has said no. That would be covered under that clause. Because if a student went and saw you in that production and you're now affecting how that student perceives you in the classroom, that may be behavior unbecoming of your position in terms of your effectiveness in the classroom. So it's a very vague description, and I know that those pages are also examined for the purpose of dismissal from positions, not just the idea of we're not going to hire you, maybe we're actually going to fire you or put you on some sort of probationary status. So when I began to look at what are people aware of this, there is a site, ILS TV, in the 2010 report, a whole article talking about people reporting that they're attempting to clean up their social networking sources so that they don't get themselves in trouble. And I thought this was interesting because I had a conversation with my persuasion class about this, and they said, oh yes, lots of our friends who are now juniors and seniors here at Aquinas shut down their Facebook account. They close it out completely because they're trying to eliminate the possibility that internship directors or employers could latch onto something that would be used in a discriminatory fashion in terms of placement or hiring. They all acknowledge, though, that you can try your best to clean these things up, but because of the tagging system in these different tools, that it's very difficult to fully eliminate the evidence. And especially now with Facebook's newer archival system in terms of being able to search by date, you can go back and find that a person's been tagged in a picture 6 or 7 years ago because of the ability to do that search now on Facebook, and that may extend to other social networking devices as well. Last thing that I was sort of interested in, it was this idea of the student's perspective in terms of friending faculty. And so I asked them, should faculty and students be friends on Facebook, or even be allowed to be friends on Facebook? I know those are sort of two different questions, but has blue been yes so far? Yes, blue is yes. Faculty and students, college faculty and undergraduate students should be allowed to be or should be friends on Facebook. Pink, no. Hold up your slip. Okay, so we have and an unsure, very good. And we have quite divergent opinions on this, and this was also true of the students, although it did go significantly in one direction. Oh, there you go. So in terms of the 103 students, 22 said yes, faculty and students should be allowed to be friends. 47 said no. 45.63% said no, and 37 said that they were unsure. The chi-square analysis showed that there was significantly more no's in terms of this assessment. There's a study that was put out by it's called the Faculty Focus Survey. It was a national study with 900 faculty. So it's pretty good, representation of us. Nearly 85% of the faculty that participated in the study report that they have a Facebook account. 66% are on LinkedIn and 50% use Twitter. But when they were asked if they are friends with undergraduate students, 32% say that they have friended undergraduate students, and 55% report that they connect with students on these networking devices after graduation. So I guess one of the questions is, what do we think in terms of the appropriateness for our environment and for our culture? So some takeaway thoughts. What may seem like an obvious, risky Facebook page to the people in this room may not be viewed that way by some Aquinas College students. So we have some discussing to do in terms of helping our students to recognize that potentially risk does exist. The reported personal importance of Facebook drives a lot of their perceptions. And I don't think we can take away the importance, but I think having a discussion of the place of Facebook in individuals' lives is important. This was not an area of research for my particular study, but I've actually had students say to me that they blame being on academic probation to Facebook, that they're in trouble academically because they have been overly dedicated to their Facebook accounts. That is some significant ego involvement there with using Facebook. And finally, the debate of whether faculty and students friend each other on Facebook. I guess the debate continues. And personally, I think, if I were to say, should there be policy, I like the idea of individual freedom on this, but I do think it's important to recognize that not every student's going to feel comfortable about it. So I probably would not say it's a great idea to go in and say, as a function of this class, we're all going to friend each other on Facebook so we have easy access. Probably not the best plan, although I saw articles where faculty are indeed doing that in classes. They're saying we're going to be doing team activities, et cetera, and we're all going to friend each other as a function of the syllabus. So I ask you again, are you a communication risk taker? And how is that dictated based upon context, face-to-face and social network messaging? We have a few minutes. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer, or if you just have a comment. Sister Rosemary?
This isn't a question, but related to this, there is a discussion, both academically and otherwise, about whether or not an employer asking for the password to get us into his Facebook is ethical.
Yes. I actually found several articles dealing with cases that are pending, looking at the legality of this, about accessing these accounts, and if it can be a stipulation of employment. Yes?
Just to report, because I say this to students, we went, it was a student night of one of the larger CPA firms, and they said that they lost they were one of two final companies, and the potential client went down through the list of all the people in the proposal, did not like what they saw on a staff accountant Facebook page, and gave the job to the other company. So when you say that the employers don't have a vested interest, they lost real money.
Yes.
Because of what a staff accountant had.
And the fact of the matter is, and I had my 17-year-old do this, you really don't need somebody's password to get an awful lot of information. I mean, in seconds, he was able to find things that I wouldn't necessarily be able to do or know how to do. But he's like, so if the issue of whether it's legal to make that friending process occur, the information's out there to be found regardless. Yes?
Kind of related to that, do you think that different privacy settings affect how risky people, the behaviors of people as far as risk-taking?
Sure. I absolutely think that there's a connection potentially there. And that would be an interesting follow-up project, because one of the things might be, if we look at our basic communication model, we might talk about in terms of the Johari window, whether information is hidden, whether it's more open. I think the privacy settings reflect comfort with disclosure, but it also might actually reflect that I know I'm going to put risky things on there. So does the privacy setting, an increased privacy setting, does it mean that you're going to actually engage in more risk? Because I set that setting so I can be more risky? Or is the privacy setting a function of being cautious in the first place, and so you're actually going to present fewer risk-taking behaviors on the account? I didn't ask that, but that's a really good question, and I think it's worth asking. Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you so much for coming.